Good afternoon and welcome to the Capitol Forum's 6th Annual Antitrust Thought Leaders Interview Series. My name is Karina Lubell and I am joined here today by Sara Razi, who's a partner in the antitrust group at Simpson Thacher. So thanks so much for joining us, Sara.
My pleasure.
I think today what I'd like to talk about is some of the recent trends in merger remedies. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion at both the FTC and the DOJ with Makan Delrahim and Bruce Hoffman talking or expressing a preference for structural remedies, particularly when it comes to vertical deals. Is that largely rhetoric, or have you seen a visible shift in enforcement?
Well, we've seen a visible shift, no doubt. Until fairly recently, in the past year or so, I would say, the conventional wisdom amongst practitioners was that vertical deals could get approved with a vertical remedy. With a behavioral remedy. And with the recent DOJ challenge to the AT&T Time Warner transaction, that conventional wisdom clearly is no longer entirely sound. 7 years ago, the DOJ allowed the Comcast NBC Universal transaction, which involved very much the same fact pattern of a content distributor combining with a content producer. And that deal was allowed with a behavioral remedy. And clearly that behavioral remedy that was proposed by the parties in AT&T Time Warner most recently was not allowed. And DOJ has challenged the transaction outright. So what we have now, I think, are broad implications across many industries. And most recently, not only in telecom, but also in industries such as healthcare, we're seeing significant vertical deals proposed. And so this could have ramifications, I think, that could be quite significant.
And so does this have an impact on how you counsel your clients who are considering vertical mergers?
Yes, absolutely. We need to really think about vertical implications and not just think of them as an adjunct to horizontal concerns, because many transactions will have both horizontal and vertical implications. So we need to really focus on the vertical concerns individually, and we need to ask, what are the incentives that the agencies could be concerned about being changed and ultimately leading to the kind of concern that the agency could move to block a deal or to insist upon a structural remedy as opposed to merely allowing it to go forward with a behavioral remedy.
Sure. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about structural remedies, because particularly at the FTC, in the recent past, we've seen several failed divestitures in the structural context, and one in supermarkets, another in rental cars. And I understand that you counseled a client doing another supermarket deal shortly after the failures or the shortcomings in the Albertson Safeway deal became apparent. And I'm just wondering if you saw any changes in how the FTC vetted your proposed divestiture buyers, or sort of how they looked at the remedy in that instance.
Yes, so I represented one of the parties in the first supermarket merger that came up following the Safeway Albertsons divestiture. And I did perceive that the staff was highly focused on remedy, and that they were very risk averse when it came to any sort of remedy proposal that maybe was not the clearly conventional supermarket chain buyer to take on the divested stores. And so as it related to any buyer that was perhaps lesser known, or any buyer that was smaller, independent perhaps, or even a financial buyer that didn't have operational experience in the relevant market, that those buyers were to receive heightened scrutiny by the staff. And I do think that was a reaction in a way to the staff's experience following Safeway Albertsons. That being said, I think the structural, or the substantive criteria were largely the same. There wasn't a major shift, but it was sort of the heightened sensitivity or risk aversion that I think that the staff was demonstrating, and probably rightly so, that they felt the need to make their process as rigorous as possible to ensure that a similar outcome didn't happen.
Sure.
Really, with the next supermarket merger up following that one that received a lot of attention, of course, for the divestiture not having been successful.
Right. Well, and it seems that another preference that the agencies have expressed is for the divestiture of an entire business unit. Obviously, that's not always possible, and we still see those deals going through, many of them also in retail. Can you maybe talk about some of the things that the agencies are looking for in a set of assets, short of a business unit, but that give them comfort that a divestiture will be successful?
So we have seen, of course, divestitures that have been approved or deals that have been allowed to go forward with divestitures of something less than an entire business unit. And nevertheless, the agency's clear preference is for an ongoing business and one that's severable and doesn't require sort of the piecemeal or selective divestiture of assets. I do think it's going to be potentially tougher going forward to get deals approved with something less than an ongoing business unit. We're hearing statements from agency officials from both DOJ and FTC to that effect. And so I think we're going to have potentially a heightened burden on us, on the merging parties, to demonstrate that a selective asset divestiture is going to be sufficient. And the way I would think about it is, first of all, what is the remedial concern that the agency has, and then how do we match the particular assets being divested and the buyer being proposed to demonstrate that together the buyer with those assets will be successful in restoring competition. And so there's no kind of easy answer. It's going to be very fact specific. But I do think that merging parties will need to think about assets all the way from manufacturing, distribution, intellectual property, and even R&D going forward, sales personnel, management personnel, and the like, because ultimately the agencies are looking for the remedy to restore competition from day one and on into the future. And if innovation concerns are partially motivating the agency challenge, then we'll need to be sure that R&D assets and other kind of ongoing capabilities around development are established in the divestiture package.
Sure. And I just want to go back to, I know you talked about the divestiture buyer, in particular in the context of supermarkets, and I'm just wondering more generally, the sorts of things that the agencies are looking for in a divestiture buyer. Obviously, it's going to depend on whether it is an entire business unit or not, and I'm sure that there are other factors, but are there specific things that they're looking to see from the proposed or the prospective divestiture buyer? Are there red flags that make it seem that that buyer would not be suitable? So maybe if you could just talk about buyer suitability.
Yeah, so buyer suitability is going to be specific to the relevant market and the industry, the types of assets that are being divested. But in general, the agency wants to see a market-tested buyer. They don't want to take a chance on someone. They want to see that the buyer has operational experience, that they have financial capability, and that they have a long-term commitment to the market. I think a red flag would be a buyer that perhaps can't establish that they're in it for the long haul, or that they would be inclined to exit the market if the early returns weren't good or successful. With that kind of commitment and operational experience, I think most likely you've got a buyer that can ultimately be approved. I think that another red flag that sometimes our clients are surprised by is having a presence in the relevant market. So that, although we would think, well, this is an established buyer because perhaps they've already established themselves in the relevant market, they're competing or they have a foothold, sure, that alone may be disqualifying if the staff would view that as a new overlap or a new competitive concern arising from the buyer already having a toehold in the market.
I see. Yeah, it sounds like it's probably challenging to come up with a buyer who both has experience but not so much experience in that direct market that they might compete with the merging parties.
Right, and ideally it could be expertise or experience in an adjacent market. So maybe they're not in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but they're in Philadelphia, and so they have some established reputation in the region more generally, but they're not already locally competing.
Got it. Okay. I wanted to ask you about retail mergers. I know you have a lot of experience with not just supermarkets, but retail more generally. And it seems that that is an area where we have seen a number of failed divestitures, and I'm just wondering, or at least a disproportionate number. And I'm just wondering if there's something special or unique about the retail markets that makes them more or less likely to succeed, or structural remedies less likely to succeed, or if there's anything you've observed or could tell us about that.
I think it's a fair question, but I don't think there's anything specific about retail that makes it more likely that a divestiture may fail. I do think retail can be a tough business. It can be one in which substantial distribution capability is required and efficiencies needed in order to ensure that a buyer can expand their scale and scope in a way that will make them a successful buyer where stores are dispersed across a large geography. So this is why I think the FTC staff has demonstrated a preference for chain buyers, because they already have a large footprint. They already have the ability to take on stores of a large number to add to their own scale and scope. If you have a small buyer which is looking to take on many stores and dramatically expand their scale and scope, they are more likely to have challenges in getting up to scale. So I think that's maybe one reason why we've seen divestiture failures in retail, because you may have buyers biting off more than they can chew.
Right. Well, it'll be interesting, I suppose, to see with the particularly FTC, since they deal with retail, but with their increased interest and scrutiny of the divestiture buyers and the assets, whether we continue to see those same types of failures going forward. Mm-hmm. I think, though, we are about out of time, but I appreciate you joining us this afternoon, Sara, and hope that we will have the pleasure of speaking together again. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.